bunch of these muscles are, you're going to induce rotational movements at the shoulder. Okay? And so these ones are lateral rotators, okay, because they are approaching the long axis of the humerus at an angle posteriorly. Okay, so these are the ones that are attaching posteriorly at an angle, lateral or external rotators. So when you think lateral rotators, think posterior muscles at an angle. Okay, infraspinatus, teres minor, these are rotator cuff muscles, and also the posterior deltoid can contribute to some of this. External or lateral rotation, same term. Muscles that do the same thing but from an anterior attachment are going to be medial rotators or internal rotators. And so that's going to include any muscle that attaches at an angle but from the anterior aspect, like pec major is going to be a medial rotator, latissimus and teres major, these three muscles again having a shared action of medial rotation in addition to their adduction, okay? And also this other muscle, subscapularis, the fourth rotator cuff muscle, and you can see its tendon here is definitely at an angle and anterior to the shoulder joint, so that's going to be a medial rotator. Okay. So those are like the most complicated muscle actions. You can review those on your own. They're going to get a little bit simpler here as we go into the arm. So the first thing you'll see when you look at the prosection at the level of the arm is you're going to see a muscle here, biceps. As the name implies, obviously a two-headed muscle. It's going to have a long head and a short head. And initially, when you look at it, the short head is actually going to look longer, which is a little counterintuitive, but that's because you can't see the rest of the long head tendon because it's actually within the joint capsule of the shoulder joint, okay? The biceps will insert on the bicipital tuberosity of the radius. So right here, that little asterisk, I remind you, so this crosses the elbow joint anteriorly, and if you're crossing the elbow joint anteriorly, you're going to be a flexor of the elbow. Okay, so you're going to flex at the forearm or at the elbow, and you're also going to supinate. So that would be like this, combined supination of the hand as well as flexion of the forearm, both accomplished by biceps. If you cut biceps away, so here we've cut biceps away, and you can see two other muscles now. You can see proximally, you can see this coracobrachialis muscle, okay, which is so named because it comes from the coracoid process of the scapula and to the arm or the brachium, okay? And this is going to be an adductor and flexor of the arm. And it's very easy to identify in lab because it's always going to have this nerve sticking out of it. So if you see this musculocutaneous nerve poking through a muscle, you'll know you've found the muscle belly of coracobrachialis. More distally and just underneath the biceps, so we've cut the biceps off here, you can see the brachialis muscle. The brachialis muscle inserts, as you can see here, not on the radius, but on the proximal ulna. And it's a pure flexor at the elbow, okay? The ulna is stationary and doesn't move, so it's not going to supinate the way that the biceps can, okay? And so these three muscles, the biceps, the brachialis, and the coracobrachialis, make up the entire anterior compartment of the arm, and they're all innervated by this musculocutaneous nerve, which gives off all of its motor fibers here in the arm, and then will cross the elbow joint and change name to the lateral cutaneous nerve of the forearm. So if this nerve is pinned up here, it would be musculocutaneous, either through here or in the plane between biceps and brachialis. But if it's pinned below the elbow joint, you would have to say lateral cutaneous nerve of the forearm. On the posterior arm, it's basically just this one big muscle, triceps, which has a long head up here going up to the shoulder joint all the way to the infraglenoid tubercle. It has a lateral head that's off the posterior shaft of the humerus. And there's a third head, a medial head, that you have to cut away. You have to cut away part of the lateral head to see. And you can see that's located right here on the posterior humerus. And here you see, when you cut that away, by the way, you also see more of the radial nerve coming down here, which makes sense because the radial nerve is the nerve of the posterior compartment of the arm. So any nerve you see back here is going to be radial nerve, essentially. Importantly, the long head of the triceps, because it is long, it crosses two joints. It crosses the shoulder joint and the elbow joint, so it can extend at the shoulder in addition to extension at the elbow, whereas the medial and lateral heads of triceps only extend at the elbow. Okay. There are a lot of forearm muscles, as you see here. I don't want to do this. All right, so the forearm, you know, I already said that there's a big bump here, the medial epicondyle, from which all these things are originating. Okay, and it initially may look a little confusing or daunting, but these muscles are named for where they're going. So their names tell you exactly what they're doing and where they're going. So if you have a muscle here, for instance, number 2, flexor carpi radialis. So carpi is wrist, of course, and radialis on the radial side. So it's a flexor of the wrist located on the radial side. So that's sort of the theme with which these muscles are named. So you have 5 of them here in the superficial aspect of the forearm. You have a muscle called pronator teres, this little one right here. You have a muscle, that one I just said, carpi radialis. You have a palmaris longus, this little tiny muscle right here with a big tendon, which is absent in some people. And if you flex your wrist, you can see the tendon of palmaris longus if you have one, so you can check if you happen to have one or don't happen to have one. The 4th muscle here, flexor digitorum superficialis, is going to be a flexor of the lateral digits, so everything but the thumb, essentially, this muscle right here. And finally, flexor carpi ulnaris, another one of these wrist flexors, this one on the ulnar side. I put a muscle called brachioradialis here, which is technically or developmentally a posterior compartment muscle, which is why it's in orange, but it functions actually as an elbow flexor. So it actually crosses the elbow joint and not the wrist joint. So it acts on the elbow as a flexor, even though it's innervated by the radial nerve. So that's like one weird exception. Okay. So here's the superficial compartment, and then here we cut everything away, and we can see some deep musculature. We can see this muscle right here, flexor digitorum profundus, which has 4 tendons going to each of the 4 fingers. Okay, so these 4 fingers have 2 muscles that allow them to flex, and the deep one is flexor digitorum profundus. Supinator does what it sounds like. It's this deep muscle here in the forearm. And then the thumb itself gets a flexor pollicis longus over here, which would go to the thumb. And finally, there's this sort of wristband-shaped muscle called pronator quadratus inferiorly down here. The innervation for these muscles of the forearm, again, is mostly the median nerve, with the exception of these 2 muscles, which I label A and B here. The flexor carpi ulnaris, which has been cut here, but you see its tendon would have gone down here. And then the ulnar 2 digits of flexor digitorum profundus. So half of this profundus muscle, this sort of more medial half or more ulnar half, is actually innervated by the ulnar nerve, and that makes sense because the ulnar nerve is literally right here coming down. So it just comes down here and supplies those 2 muscles. But everything else in this area is median nerve. On the extensor side, or on the posterior aspect of the forearm, you have a bunch of musculature coming from the lateral epicondyle here this time. So the common extensor tendon gives rise to these muscles right here. And again, named for where they're going and what they're doing. So extensor carpi radialis brevis, which is a Latin word that means short. Okay. Extensor digitorum, extensor digiti minimi for the pinky, etc., etc. So these are all a bunch of muscles going down here to either extend at the wrist or to extend at the digits, okay? However, there are two muscles here that don't originate at the common extensor tendon, and they actually go above and cross the elbow joint and originate on this feature called the supracondylar ridge, which is this bony ridge right here on the humerus. Okay, so that supracondylar ridge serves as an origin for these two muscles. First, brachioradialis, which I talked about before, which was that forearm flexor. So it starts back here, but wraps around anteriorly. And this other muscle right here, extensor carpi radialis longus. So the way that you would identify these in lab is that you would look for this common extensor tendon and look for muscle fibers that go beyond that, and then you'll know you'll have found these two, and then from there you can deduce everything from sort of mediolateral and tendon relationships down here at the wrist and hand. And the innervation here is very easy. Any muscle you see here on the posterior compartment must be innervated by the radial nerve without exception. Okay. The deep compartment here, where the muscles have been cut away, you can see part of the radial nerve here, which at this point would be called something else, but it's basically the radial nerve innervating all these things. You see some extrinsic muscles of the thumb here. So anytime you see the word pollicis, it means of or relating to the thumb. So pollex is thumb in Latin. So these are all extrinsic movers of the thumb. You have two extensors and an abductor of the thumb, as well as an extrinsic extensor of the index finger, all located right here. Okay. And the way that you will identify these in lab, again, is by where their tendons are going. So if you follow, let's say, number 1 on this slide, you follow its tendon going down, you see it would go to the thumb, you see its tendon would be most on the dorsal surface, and that's how you would know that this one, for instance, would be the tendon of extensor pollicis longus. The one right next to it down here, extensor pollicis brevis. So that's how you want to look at these things, is you want to find the muscle belly and then trace the tendon down, sort of positively identify what you're looking at. Okay, running out of time. The hand has a bunch of intrinsic, so these were like extrinsic hand muscles, and now we'll have intrinsic hand muscles entirely within the palmar surface of the hand. And then broadly, they're separated into two major groups. There's a thenar group of musculature, which is this fleshy pad by your thumb, okay, and that contains 3 muscles: a flexor pollicis brevis, an abductor pollicis, and an opponens pollicis. The hypothenar group is the fleshy pad just underneath your pinky, and that contains the same muscles as the thenar group, except instead of pollicis, it's digiti minimi or digiti quinti or whatever you want. Movers of the pinky. Okay. However, importantly, these muscles of the thenar group are innervated by the median nerve. Okay, so this is median nerve innervation right here. And these muscles of the hypothenar group and all the other muscles of the hand are innervated by the ulnar nerves. That's an important difference that you should know. Deep to the thenar group of muscles is a big 2-headed muscle called the adductor pollicis, which will obviously adduct the thumb. So finishing off with blood supply. Some of these arteries we've seen, right? So we've seen the aortic arch, we've seen the brachiocephalic trunk. On the right side, you've seen the subclavian artery already, and we've even seen the axillary artery, most of it. Now we're going to see the continuation of the axillary artery into the brachial artery, into radial and ulnar arteries, into a bunch of arteries in the palm. And there are specific locations. So obviously this is like one big artery until the elbow, but it has a bunch of different names relative to some key anatomical landmarks. So does anybody remember like the junction where the subclavian artery would change its name to the axillary artery, which we learned a long time ago? Nope. That would make intuitive sense though, right? Anyone remember?
Say it again.
When does the subclavian artery become the axillary artery? What?
Somewhere in the triangle.
When it crosses the lateral border of the first rib. So when it crosses, which is roughly demarcated by this dotted line here. Roughly. The rib is not even drawn on here. But so at that point you have axillary artery, and the axillary artery will continue until this dotted line, which is supposed to be the lateral edge of teres major muscle. Okay, so this is where the teres major, I told you teres major is from the inferior angle of the scapula up to the humerus. So this is where teres major would be. And that's where you'll go from axillary artery to brachial artery. Okay, brachial artery in the upper limb. And then typically, not always, but typically the brachial artery will split at the level of the elbow or the cubital fossa into a radial and ulnar artery, which will go to their respective sides. And then the ulnar artery will go down and contribute the majority of the blood flow to this structure called the superficial palmar arch, which is this arcuate artery right here. And then the radial artery will do the same thing and contribute most of its blood flow to a deeper palmar arch, so the deep palmar arch, okay? Now this is sort of the general layout. Now we're going to look at it in a little bit more detail, some of the branches within each one of these subsections. Okay, so blood supply in and around the axilla. So again, we have this division between subclavian and axillary.